At WayScript, we spend a lot of time thinking about developers and the challenges they face. So today we are focusing on security, which is critical to software teams, regardless of their size. And security vulnerabilities can come from the code we write, the packages we're using, the open source code we use, even the business logic we're using. And as an engineering leader, it can be really overwhelming to address it at an organization level. Especially if you're just building that team out. So we wanted to hear from an expert who spends a lot of time thinking about this challenge. And we're very lucky to have Tyler Healy with us today to talk about baking in security mindedness into development teams. Tyler is a security engineer who has over 16 years of experience in information security. He is currently the VP of Security at DigitalOcean, which is a cloud infrastructure provider headquartered in New York. He is also a fellow at the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology, which is a DC-based nonprofit for cybersecurity research and policy. And he's a startup advisor for developer experience in tech, in particular for our startup, which is WayScript. Welcome, Tyler.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. So we'd love to start off with, first, can you tell us a little bit about what is a security engineer and how is that different from a software engineer?
Yeah, so there are actually a few different flavors of security engineering. So just to kind of bring it to the DigitalOcean side of the world, we have a security software engineering team that is the more traditional software engineers, but who are building security services for the rest of our engineering teams to use. So that could be, secrets management, encryption libraries. They happen to build all of the fraud and abuse detection services that run DO. So they're actually building, essentially really like customer facing or customer impacting services. Mm-hmm. So they are more traditional software engineers, but working on security problems. But there are also a brand of security engineer that I think is a little more traditional security engineer, where it's an engineer who focuses on building or really like integrating security products into either the development environment or for the company as a whole. So identity and access management, or vulnerability management, or securing your laptop. So all there are hundreds or probably thousands of security tools that a company could integrate into their environment. And so there is a whole world of expertise around security engineering on how to engineer a company and the company infrastructure securely. And that can have endpoint focus or network focus, identity focus. So you can get incredibly deep into each one of these different verticals. And so when you say security engineer, it's actually sometimes a little difficult, even when we go through like the hiring process, because we can say security engineer, but it could mean, one of 20 different focus tracks for people. So it's interesting because there's so much to get into in the security space that being a security engineer can open to so many different doors to different layers of expertise.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And how does, as an organization, how do you determine like which of those kind of niches or verticals do you really want to invest in?
Yeah, a lot of that ties back to the risk landscape and kind of the threat landscape for the business and the different size of the business. So a startup that has 15 people probably doesn't need someone whose entire job is focused on vulnerability management or even identity and access management. Right. You're going to bring in someone who can cover a lot of those different topics from a broad standpoint. But really, it starts with the risk landscape. So if you're a fintech company or a crypto exchange, if you have business customers versus consumers as your target market, if you're purely a technology company versus there's a lot of tech-enabled services company these days, all of those things will define where you want to really start. And a lot of it just comes back to the customer, right? I mean, if you just put it from this, how are we building trust with our customers? That's usually the best starting point, is to say, all right, what's the customer data? How are they interacting with my product? And then that can start lead you down the path towards where your first real investments would be from a security standpoint.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Like starting with what's going to impact the customer at all and working your way backwards. Yeah. And how does that interaction, so once you've determined, all right, here's this kind of dedicated security team, and for example, you mentioned a lot of at DigitalOcean, you have a team that's actually integrating these products internally, or creating tools for DigitalOcean engineers themselves. What is that
Yep.
interaction like? How do they fit into the org as a whole?
Yeah. The model that I believe is essential for security teams is to very much be a relationship-led, partner-based model with the rest of the business.
Mhm.
There's like a traditional view of the security world is security writes a bunch of policies and then tries to apply it to the business, and it
Right.
fails miserably a lot of the times because you're not in it with the rest of the organization,
Yeah.
learning about what their problems are and how to solve them together. For example, just in the world of DigitalOcean, we have a lot of systems engineers because we do a lot of kernel work and performance work because we are cloud. So how much performance we can get out of each bare metal hypervisor is a big difference for our customers and for us as a business. And so we have teams dedicated to that space. And so securing the endpoint devices that folks are working on in that space where you can have like that little bit of performance impact
Mhm.
on the engineer actually makes a big difference to their day-to-day job. Like you have to get into the mindset that you're working together to secure the business, relative to what everyone needs to do for the day-to-day job, versus it just being like, all right, here's a security control framework.
Right.
We're gonna check the box on all this stuff, because what you end up doing is you end up actually having people work around you. Uh,
Mm.
and that actually introduces more risk to the business. You kind of want to be out there, and be a part of the problem solving, and friendly with everyone in the organization, because it opens up lines of communications where you can hear things that might be risky and get on top of it quickly.
Yeah, no, this actually reminds me of something I've heard you say before, which is that security is a team sport, and that collaborative approach to security is essential, like you said, for it to be adopted and for it to work
Yeah.
well. And I'm curious, what does that look like at DigitalOcean? So it sounds like it's working, and what does that mean to you, kind of on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's where I've spent a lot of my security career, at least over the past half decade, is more thinking about how security teams are successful, less about the technologies themselves, because technologies will come and go. The threat landscape is always changing. That's one of the best parts about security is it's there's never a dull moment in security. If something is always happening and changing. But that's just being really good at the security technology is not really what makes a security team successful. What makes a security team successful is the ability to be uh, engaged across the business. And so for my day to day, I was thinking about this, so I think I mentioned this to someone I was talking with recently. I probably spend more time with marketing and finance and the product teams than I do even with the technical teams sometimes. And a lot of that is just being in the conversations about where we're heading as a business. Where do we think our customer base is heading, and how are we building trust with our customers? And
Mm.
all of that starts way before you start picking security technologies.
Yes.
So an example for DO where security is really plugged into the business, not just trying to secure the technology that the business is building, is we own all of the fraud and abuse tooling that happens during a customer sign-up lifecycle. So someone comes to DigitalOcean website, they try and create an account. Um, Cloud infrastructure can be used to do fraudulent and harmful things. So a lot of people try and create accounts in large volumes to go, you know, ostensibly defraud us or other people or harm others on the internet. And it's our job to help secure that. So we are at almost every single stage of the customer sign-up lifecycle, which is somewhere where marketing is
Mhm.
interested because they're trying to drive more and more and more customers to our platform. And so we're striking a balance between friction through the customer sign-up lifecycle, making sure that their engagement is smooth and we're not adding too much friction, but we're also preventing the bad guys from using our platform to do harmful things. And so that natural tension between security and marketing, I have found to be, really one of my strongest relationships at DO, because we have such a strong working relationship where we get to talk about the real problem of security and how that interacts with the growth targets that we have, especially now as a public company. Those are public growth targets in which investors are looking at, and so we are constantly building the right tension, and turning the levers in the right way to accomplish both the goals. So it's been actually really rewarding to be in that part of the conversation, instead of just, all right, someone's building something, we got to help them figure out how to go secure it.
It doesn't feel like this like obligation of like, oh yeah, and we got to do something about security. Like as the last step, we got to bring this
exactly. Yep. Yeah, exactly. And that's where you want to be, because if you can start and you mentioned it earlier, sort of like the business logic conversation is a lot of where their security problems manifest from the very beginning. If you're bringing in security super late to come fix, plug the holes after a ship is already sailing, that's not going to be a great situation. But if you can be a part of that ideation process and what is the business logic that we're trying to bring to life, you can do it in a way that can sustain the business rather than hamper it.
That is, like, I think, a very important take and perspective on security. Is it's not something that is actually meant to slow down velocity or slow down that innovation. It sounds like it actually enables that. Can you talk to us a little more about that? What is it like, or what is DigitalOcean now experience now that security is so involved in the conversations, so like early on in the business?
It's great because we get to be even part of the product release life cycle. As we're bringing a new product to life and a new product to our customers. We're about to launch our serverless offering, which is pretty exciting. Security was ostensibly had a dedicated resource from day one on that launch, and we uncovered a few things early on that were going to be a little bit of a concern by the time we got to GA, and we were able to work with product leadership and engineering leadership to make some adjustments along the way, to address some of those risks before launch in a way that would allow us to have both a successful launch on time, but also one where our customers can trust the product right out of the gate. And so it's hard to do because sometimes you do have to make concessions. Like there are tons of features that DO products have launched with in the past, even while I've been here, where it's been, man, I would really love to have this particular security feature on the product by the time we launch, but that's not always possible because GA dates have a lot wrapped up in them in terms of customer expectations, marketing expectations, investor expectations, and you can't really miss those marks. And so it's about figuring out what is the right trade-off to be making, and you can only really do that by having that team sport, early engagement mentality, and building that culture within the security team.
Totally, like being there in the moment, right? Like instead of like afterwards being caught up to it. And similar to what you said with the GA launch, there's so much risk about that timeline moving. And I think people will often think of QA, compliance, security. This side is like, that's what adds that risk factor. So if that's just baked in the beginning, then I don't know, I just feel like it's a win-win all around.
Yeah, we get to have open and honest conversations about what those things mean and make the right, really, it's a risk-based decision because we could be adding risk to ourselves or to our customers. And in some circumstances, that's going to be okay. There's no such thing unless you're a particular government agencies. There's really no such thing as like a zero risk game. You're always taking in some amount of risk especially as a cloud service provider or anything where you're a developer experience environment where you're handing someone else computing power. Really, no matter what product you have some amount of risk baked in, and it's about making the right choices at the right time.
That makes sense. And how do you make sure that like people off of the security teams actually hold up their end of the bargain? So how do you make sure that sales remembers to include you in those conversations? Marketing is like, yep, we got to have this team in early on. How does that work?
Yeah, that is always it can be a tough thing, but it starts very early on in a security team's life cycle, and it changes though during the growth stage of a business. So when a company is like 50 people or 100 people, or even up to like really 250 people, you can make it very relationship based, where you spend a lot of time talking with various business leaders in all the different parts of the organization, and you communicate the goals of the security program in a way that people can attach to, and so much of it comes down to communication. I mean, that's a big piece that sometimes gets lost in security, is just how important communication is for the security team to connect with the rest of the business, which then helps you achieve your goals. So that's how it starts. But eventually, if you get to 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 person company, or even larger than that, right? You can't know everyone in the business, and you
Right.
certainly can't implicitly trust everyone in the business is going to be doing the right things, because humans are the weakest link in security. That's just a fact of life.
Terrifying
And so,
fact.
what's that?
I said it's just the most terrifying fact because
I
what
know.
are you going to do?
It is, and it's, yeah. And so what you end up having to do is you do have to start to institute stricter controls and go of more of like a broad-based policy approach, but still do it in a way that is connective
Sure.
with the organization at large. But it's unfortunately, you can't just be all places all times. And then also create what I call like a security advocates model. Some really large companies that I've seen or been at in the past do things like a BISO model, which is like a business information security officer, where a particular line of business will have a dedicated person to security, and their whole job is essentially to be a partner between the main security team and that business unit.
Right.
That only happens when you're like really start to get large scale.
Sure.
But security advocates is a great way to get started if you don't have dedicated resourcing across each of the verticals.
Yeah, no, and actually that's a perfect segue of like, say you are just starting off and so your team is like maybe 5, 10, 20 developers or something like that.
Yeah.
Like, if we haven't decided that it's time to invest in a dedicated security resource, then what should we be doing? Or should we be thinking about hiring that resource? Or, what is it
Yeah,
we should go after?
I think so. I think it's probably around 50 is when companies start thinking about a dedicated security person at the very least. Um, that could be someone who is sort of hip to hip with the engineering team, depending on the type of product and the style of business. But that's generally where it would sit. But it really comes down to fundamentals. Like every engineer should have the idea of two-factor authentication,
Yep.
not putting secrets in code,
Yep.
using encryption appropriately, treating customer data appropriately. Like you don't have to get super fancy with all the tool sets, but you just have to get those basics down. And as long as you have those as a starting point, by the time you start to add a security team, life will be
A lot
a lot easier to integrate in a security team to the organization.
Yeah. Makes sense. All right. Well, my last question for you before, any kind of advice was, you
Yeah.
talked about the friction and minimizing friction when you're working within DigitalOcean itself. Can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit more about that tension? Like what is the perceived tension that you have to fight against?
Yeah. Well, there's a few different ones. One is that, security stuff is going to slow me down, right? And obviously product releases. And again, that's just a lot of that just comes down to messaging about, how do we get involved early and make things less painful towards the end, which I have experienced in the past, even at DO, where someone will go to do a product release and realize that they haven't gotten security involved at all. Someone will say that, and they'll bring us in the last minute. And we've actually had to like squash a release. It's been fairly minor, generally speaking, but it does happen. So there's tension there. There's also the tension that like security is watching me all the time, which is a really funny one because we're really here to protect the business and our employees and our customers, but you deploy an agent on every single laptop for antivirus, anti-malware purposes or whatever. And someone's like, oh, this can see everything I'm doing. So there's kind of a brother factor involved. That one's a little tougher to solve for because you'll always have people in the organization who think that way, and that's okay. They're being paranoid about that is certainly like their right to think that way. And so I don't try and fight it. I just kind of embrace the fact that there will always be the org that kind of feel.
Yeah, just gotta acknowledge it and say, we'll give you as much information as we can.
That's exactly right. Try and be as transparent and open about how it all works, and when do we exercise administrative privileges that could see data, and how we protect those things, and just be really open and honest about it. But at the end of the day, you'll never convince everyone, and that's
you probably shouldn't. That's probably not where you're wanting to spend
exactly. Yeah, if you over index there, it can be detrimental as well. Yeah.
I love it. Great. Well, Tyler, this has been awesome. Are there any kind of like last thoughts that you have or advice that you would give to maybe someone who was in your shoes, but a much smaller organization? Anything that you want to leave us with?
No, this has been excellent. Thanks for having me on. I would just say that, security is just as much about thinking about what the business needs as it is about solving security technical problems, which are super fun. Obviously, they're really exciting problems in the security space, but keeping the business framing in mind is really a key to success, I think.
Love that. Great. Well, thank you, Tyler.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it.